Hi guys. Today we're talking about the topic of demand, which is obviously one of the big issues in economics. So we'll spend some time with this, but today is mostly just about introduction. When we talk about demand, we're talking about, as far as the definition goes, we're talking about all the quantities that are demanded. Remember, a quantity is just singular. We're talking all the quantities that are demanded of a certain good at a certain price. So we have to be real specific about the good or service we're talking about. I'm going to talk about coffee as my example because I like coffee. But the conversation is a little different depending on whether I'm talking about a bag or whether I'm talking about a single cup, something that would be prepared for me. So you have to be very specific, otherwise you're going to get yourself confused and your analysis isn't going to be very sharp. So specific good or service, and then also we need to understand that the market is made up of individuals. So I have demand for coffee at various prices, but so does Miss Stock next door and Mr. Ross, except he's in England. Anyway, when we look at the market, all those are going to be combined. However, then we have to understand how big is the market. So when I'm looking at buying coffee, how far would I drive? Probably not very far. I mean, to get a better coffee or to get a better price. So if it's true that I'm not going to go very far, then the market is rather small. But something that's more expensive, say a car, I'm going to be willing to drive much further to find a better car, the car I'm looking for, and to save some money. When we talk about demand, it's important we understand that we express this as the law of demand. We call it a law partly because we have physics envy, and I've talked to you about this before, but also because it's true almost all of the time. There are some cases where the law of demand isn't true, but they are very rare, and we'll talk about them. We recognize that. So the law of demand is this. If I change price, it's going to affect the quantity, again, one quantity. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. If I change the price, it's going to affect the quantity demanded. We always refer to this as QD. You'll notice in economics we have lots of abbreviations we like to use. There's always going to be an inverse relationship, which means when one goes up, the other goes down. It's important when we talk about this that we understand that price is always the variable we change. It holds true the other way if we change quantity demanded, but because of the way we express things, most people get really confused if you do it that way. So, for example, if I say, well, the price of coffee goes up, what would you assume happens to my demand for coffee? You'd probably assume that I buy less coffee. And that's easy, and nobody ever has a hard time with that. If I switch it and I say the quantity that I demand of coffee goes up, does it make sense that the price would fall? That doesn't seem to make sense. Or I guess if I were to walk into the coffee shop and say to the coffee person, I really don't want very much coffee right now. They should lower the price for me, but it's unlikely that would occur. So again, the easiest way to keep from making those kind of mistakes, and I'll explain the mistake. The mistake is when I'm talking about me wanting more coffee or everyone in the market wanting more coffee, I'm not talking about one quantity anymore. I'm talking about all the quantities. Therefore, I've done something different than what this says because I've broken that rule right there. So if we change price first, and that's how we do it, so if I say I make the price higher, we can assume people will demand less. If I make the price lower, people will demand it more. So that's what we call an inverse relationship. We show this on what's called a demand curve. And the demand curve is a very common diagram in economics. We're going to use it all the time, so get very used to it. When we set this up, we need to be very specific in setting it up the right way. Quantity goes on the x-axis, price goes on the y-axis. This might frustrate some of you because maybe you just figured out when I said price is the variable changed. What that means is price is the independent variable. Well, normally in math, you put the independent variable on the x-axis, but economics, we don't do it that way, so sorry. Okay, so price is our variable we're going to change, and it goes on the y-axis. You notice I have some numbers here, and they're not necessarily to the same scale. That's okay. 0 is the origin, and we always increase to the right and increase going up. The scale should be consistent on each axis, but they don't have to be consistent with each other. I label the Q and the P, I label the demand curve D, and then I've got some points I'm going to talk about, point A and point B. The most important thing you notice about point A and point B is they're both on the demand curve that I drew. So when I drew that demand curve, and again, this is a learning device, what I'm saying is this represents all the quantities at all the various prices in that market. So point A, what I'm saying is, when the price is 3, the quantity that will be demanded is 10. I draw dotted lines down to the axis, and I label those points because I want to make sure I can talk about them. So it's not kind of 3 and kind of 10, it's 3 and 10. If I lower price to 2, and that's why I have that arrow here and here, if I lower price to 2, quantity demanded increases by 10, from 10 to 20, and that's point B. Okay, again, note that a demand curve, because of the inverse relationship, again, if you understand a lot of math, you'll understand that it's got to have a negative slope. We are saying ceteris paribus, so if I'm talking about coffee, I'm talking about the exact same coffee. I'm not talking about coffee from Starbucks versus coffee from the grocery store. I'm not talking about, a triple venti soy caramel macchiato versus a cup of drip coffee. They have to be the exact same product, otherwise it gets very confusing. The conclusions you reach, as you notice as I went through that, we always are going to find our conclusions here or here. Most of the time, the conclusion, the thing that we care about, what we're studying, is going to be down here on the Q or x-axis, but not always. Okay. These are the non-price determinants of demand, okay? So since I say that they're non-price determinants, what does that mean about price? If I say, who are the non-Messi players for Argentina? What does that mean about Messi? Well, he's obviously the person that you would talk about first, the most important person in Argentinian football. Somebody like me, I can't name any other Argentinian footballers, but I can name him. So, are those other guys unimportant? No, they're an important part of the team. But the biggest part of the team is price, okay? So these are the other things that affect demand that aren't price. I always abbreviate it D of D. Okay, here they are. So how much do you want a good or a service? Has it been a while since I've had coffee and I'm really in the mood for coffee? Is it coffee in the morning versus coffee in the afternoon? Okay, so that's the number behind price. Probably the biggest effect on demand is taste and preference. It can mean literal taste, or it can mean taste for a type of music. You don't taste it, but still it's preference. Price of other products. So if I'm looking at Starbucks coffee, well, what about the price of Dunkin' Donuts coffee? Okay, if the price of Dunkin' Donuts coffee falls, maybe I choose to buy it instead, and that has an effect on my demand for Starbucks coffee. Income. How much money do I make? The more money I make, the more likely it is that I'm going to buy more coffee. Government policies. This might be a government program that is saying, hey, you shouldn't drink so much coffee, or hey, you should drink more. So it's usually some sort of policy that's going to be linked to taste and preference. By the way, for the most part, these are in descending order. Government policies are probably less important than these other three. In fact, we're going to study these other three more in depth specifically. Okay, lastly is demographics. So if I'm Starbucks and I'm looking at my market and a bunch of people start to move into town, and maybe they drink coffee or maybe they don't drink coffee. Maybe they drink a lot of coffee or maybe they only drink a little. Maybe they prefer frozen drinks, maybe they prefer hot drinks. Okay, so demographics is simply about who am I selling to, and it recognizes that those things can change. When one of these changes, the quantity demanded at the same price will change. So if I buy 5 cups of coffee a week and my income goes up, at the same price, 30 Rand, maybe instead of 5 cups of coffee, I would buy 6. If that's true, what will happen is the whole demand curve is going to change. So if let's switch it back to dollars. If at $2, I buy 20 cups of coffee a month, but then I start to make more money, or my taste for coffee goes up, or the price of tea goes up, or something like that. Anyway, at the same price too, instead of buying 20, I would now buy 30. The problem is this point that I've put here, and I see I didn't label it, but this point that I'll call B, and call that A, it's not on the original demand curve. It's not on D1. So it has to be on some curve, therefore it's on a new demand curve, and you see I labeled that D2. Still have my arrow to indicate movement so I know what happens. We call this a shift. We say overall the demand curve shifted. It was here, but it's not anymore. Now it's there. Okay? If this is income, it means overall everyone in your market started to make more money. Maybe the economy's better, something like that. Okay, so we call this a shift. We also will call it a change in overall demand. So we mean all the demand for the product, there's been a change, not just because of price. And the law of demand still applies. We move the curve from here to here, but on this new curve, we can still see if I lower price, quantity demanded increases. Okay, wrapping up. The most important relationship in all of this is the relationship between price and quantity. That's why we put price and quantity on the two axes, because it's the most important thing that we're going to study. We will study some other things like income with quantity, but if that's true, we'll put income on one of the axes. Quantity is always a singular. At $2, I want 20 cups of coffee, not 21, not 19, 20. When we talk about movements, and demand, it's all of the quantities put together. When we talk about movements, if I'm going up and down one demand curve, both price and quantity are going to change. So this is along the existing demand curve. If I'm going to move the demand curve, so a movement of the demand curve, not along, so a movement of the demand curve means that all of the quantities are going to change. So at the same price, we have a new quantity.